Commander Tom Molley stood in his pristinely polished office, staring at the official requisition forms, spread across his desk like the remains of his once promising career. The papers bore the seal of the Intergalactic Military Academy's Educational Enhancement Division, and in elegant script, they detailed what some bureaucratic genius had deemed a revolutionary teaching method. Tom's 3 eyes blinked in sequence, a nervous habit he'd developed since taking this assignment. Brilliant, he muttered to himself, his voice dripping with the kind of sarcasm that could corrode hull plating. Absolutely brilliant. Let's bring apex predators from death worlds into a classroom full of pampered alien brats. What could possibly go wrong? The Intergalactic Military Academy stood as a monument to excessive funding and even more excessive egos. Carved from imported Viridian marble, and suspended in the zero-gravity luxury of the Centauri orbital platform, it housed the offspring of the galaxy's most influential military families. These weren't your average recruits fresh from the farm worlds. No, these were the sons and daughters of admirals, generals, and planetary governors who treated military service like an extended vacation with fancy uniforms. Tom had been teaching here for 3 standard years, long enough to know that most of his students couldn't identify genuine danger if it bit them on their perfectly groomed posteriors. Which, considering today's lesson plan, might actually happen. The Academy's corridors hummed with the quiet efficiency of automated systems and the not-so-quiet arrogance of entitled youth. Floating platforms carried students between classes, because walking was apparently beneath them. The walls displayed holographic trophies from 1,000 conquered worlds, none of which these particular students had any hand in conquering. Their biggest challenge to date had been choosing between imported delicacies in the dining hall, and now, some administrative mastermind had decided these soft-spoiled creatures needed to learn about real threats from across the galaxy. Hence the arrival of what the shipping manifest euphemistically labeled as Educational Specimen 247B. Tom's communicator chirped, and the gruff voice of Quartermaster crackled through. "Commander Molley, your special delivery has arrived. Bay 17. And sir, the containment unit is making some rather unsettling sounds." "Define unsettling, Quartermaster." "Well sir, imagine the sound of a dying star having an argument with a supernova, but angrier." Tom's mandibles clicked together in what passed for a resigned sigh among his species. "On my way." Bay 17 reeked of fear, industrial cleansers, and something distinctly organic. The containment unit sat in the center of the bay like a metallic coffin, though considerably more lively. It was standard military issue, designed to hold the most dangerous creatures in the known galaxy, and judging by the way it occasionally shuddered and rang like a bell, its current occupant was testing those design specifications. "Meet Brutus," Tom announced to no one in particular, reading from the accompanying datasheet. "Male Ursus arctos horribilis. 800 pounds of fur, claws, teeth, and what the humans charmingly call attitude. Captured from the North American continent of Earth, a Class 7 death world, where apparently these things are considered wildlife." He shook his head in disbelief. Humans lived on the same planet as these creatures, and called them wildlife. The same species that had somehow convinced the Galactic Council they were civilized enough for interstellar diplomacy, also shared real estate with mobile mountains of murder. The containment unit gave another violent shake, and Tom could swear he heard what sounded like frustrated huffing from within. "Don't worry, Brutus," Tom said to the container, his voice heavy with impending doom. "In about 2 hours, you're going to meet some of the most obnoxious, overconfident little parasites this side of the Andromeda Galaxy. I have a feeling you'll get along just fine." Meanwhile, in the Academy's recreational lounge, General Krafnog's son, Zephyr, was holding court among his usual circle of sycophants and fellow aristocrats. Zephyr possessed all the charm of a solar flare, and twice the destructive potential, though considerably less intelligent. "I heard today's specimen is from that primitive mudball Earth," Zephyr announced, his voice carrying the kind of confidence usually reserved for those who had never faced actual danger. His scaled hide shimmered with bioluminescent patterns that supposedly indicated superior breeding, though Tom suspected they mostly indicated superior nutrition and inferior, scoffed Larina, whose family controlled 3 mining systems, and whose personality could strip paint. "Isn't that the planet where they still use projectile weapons and combustion engines? How dangerous could anything from there possibly be?" "My father says Earth creatures are all bluff and no substance," added Corvin, a slug-like being, whose species had achieved spaceflight by literally buying it from someone else. "Probably just another oversized herbivore with anger management issues." Zephyr's crest flared with amusement. "I bet I could tame whatever pathetic beast they've brought us." These primitive world creatures always back down when faced with superior intelligence and breeding. The group dissolved into laughter, the kind of laughter that comes from those who have never truly been tested, never faced real consequences, and never learned the difference between confidence and stupidity. 20 credits, says it runs away the moment I approach, Zephyr declared. Make it 50, Corvin countered. These earth animals are probably afraid of their own shadows. If Brutus could have heard them, he might have found their confidence amusing. But Brutus was currently focused on more immediate concerns, like the fact that his breakfast had consisted of processed nutrition cubes instead of salmon, and his accommodations lacked both running water and convenient trees for marking territory. In the depths of his ursine mind, Brutus was developing what humans might recognize as a profoundly bad mood. The academic theater represented everything the intergalactic military academy stood for, excess disguised as education. The demonstration chamber rose 3 stories high, its walls constructed from transparent aluminum strong enough to contain a small nuclear explosion, or as the designers hopefully assumed, one moderately irritated Earth predator. Commander Tom Molly surveyed the amphitheater seating that surrounded the reinforced arena below. 67 seats arranged in ascending tiers, each equipped with personal force field generators, emergency escape pods, and what the manufacturer cheerfully called panic buttons. The academy spared no expense when it came to keeping their precious students safe, while they learned about danger from a comfortable distance. The chamber itself was a sterile white-walled box roughly the size of a shuttle bay. Environmental controls could simulate everything from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest, though today's settings remain boringly terrestrial. Standard gravity, Earth normal atmosphere, and temperature controls set to what the manual described as temperate mammalian comfort zones. At least someone read the care instructions, Tom muttered, checking his tablet for the 100th time. The demonstration protocols were thick enough to serve as body armor, covering everything from emergency procedures to liability waivers. Apparently, even the galaxy's most prestigious military academy worried about angry parents when their little darlings got traumatized by educational experiences. The students filed in, with all the enthusiasm of spoiled nobility, attending a mandatory cultural event. They clustered in their usual social hierarchies, species segregating naturally into familiar groups. Zephyr claimed the front row center seat, naturally. His entourage spread out around him like colorful satellites, orbiting a particularly arrogant planet. To his left sat Vrex, whose crystalline carapace caught the light and threw rainbow patterns across his neighbors. Vrex's species had evolved from predatory insects, though judging by his soft middle and carefully manicured claws, the only thing he hunted these days was compliments. I still say this is beneath us, Vrex announced, his voice carrying the musical tones his species used when trying to sound important. We should be studying fleet tactics, not looking at zoo animals. Behind them, Nastica and her twin brother Garith represented the aquatic Zilonian Empire. Their specialized breathing apparatus bubbled softly as they argued in whispers about optimal seating for viewing angles. The Zilonians had conquered 17 star systems through superior naval tactics, though these particular specimens looked more suited to synchronized swimming than space combat. Admiral Drehorn's daughter, Kylie, occupied a middle row with calculated precision. Neither too eager in the front, nor too disinterested in the back, she maintained the perfect image of military propriety her famous father demanded. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture textbook perfect, and her expression suggested she found the entire proceedings slightly distasteful. The Theridian Collective sent 3 representatives, identical in their hive-minded arrogance. They sat in perfect symmetry, their antennae twitching in unison as they communicated through pheromone releases that smelled vaguely of rotting fruit and superiority complexes. But it was the figure in the back corner who caught Tom's attention, though not for the usual reasons. Amy Kowalski sat alone in the upper tier, as far from the demonstration chamber as the seating allowed. Unlike her classmates, she wore no elaborate uniform modifications, no family insignia, no displays of wealth or status. Just the standard Academy cadet uniform in regulation gray. She was small by galactic standards, barely 5.5 feet tall, with the kind of unremarkable appearance that made most aliens forget she was there. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried a standard-issue datapad rather than the custom models favored by her wealthier classmates. Tom had almost forgotten about the human exchange student. Earth had only recently joined the Galactic Federation, and their single representative to the academy generated about as much interest as a broken food dispenser. Most students seemed to view her as a curiosity at best, a primitive barbarian trying to play dress-up in civilized society. Attention, cadets. Tom's voice echoed through the chamber's speakers. Today's lesson focuses on threat assessment and species adaptation. You'll observe a specimen from Earth, classification Ursus arctos horribilis. Horribilis. Zephyr laughed, the sound like grinding metal. They actually named it horrible. How charmingly primitive. I heard Earth creatures are all evolutionary dead ends, added Corvin from his hover seat, designed to support his considerable bulk. No energy weapons, no natural armor, no psionic abilities. Just teeth and claws like savages. The betting started immediately. 50 credits that the Earth beast would cower in the corner. 100 that it would try to hide behind the environmental decorations. 200 that it would submit the moment it saw superior alien intelligence. Amy Kowalski said nothing, just watched quietly as her classmates demonstrated exactly why their species would probably never survive first contact with a particularly grumpy house cat, let alone something with Brutus's disposition. Tom noticed her silence, and felt a nagging worry. In his experience, the quiet ones were usually either completely terrified or knew something everyone else didn't. Given that this particular quiet one came from the same planet as the creature they were about to release, he was beginning to suspect it might be the latter. Places, everyone, Tom announced, though his voice carried considerably less enthusiasm than Academy protocol demanded. The demonstration will begin in 60 seconds. Commander Tom Molly's fingers hovered over the control panel like a pianist preparing for a particularly challenging concerto. The difference being that most concertos didn't involve releasing apex predators in front of an audience of overconfident teenagers. Initiating Beast Release Protocol 7 Alpha, he announced, his voice carrying the mandatory authority required by Academy standards. All safety systems are now active. Emergency barriers are charged. Medical teams are standing by. Zephyr snorted from his front row seat. Medical teams, for watching a glorified pet. How pathetically overcautious. Tom's mandibles twitched. If only the little prince knew that Beast Release Protocol 7 Alpha had been developed after the infamous Regelian sandworm incident that had left 3 instructors requiring extensive therapy and 1 permanently afraid of beaches. Phase 1, Environmental Preparation. Tom continued, watching his readouts like a flight controller during a solar storm. Atmospheric composition confirmed Earth normal. Temperature adjusted to specimen comfort range. Gravity set to homeworld standard. The demonstration chamber hummed with invisible energy as force fields activated in overlapping layers. The first barrier could stop a charging rhinoceros. The second could contain a small explosion. The third was rated for unknown alien megafauna with anger management issues, which seemed uncomfortably relevant to today's lesson. Phase 2, Containment Unit Positioning, Tom announced. A mechanical arm lowered the transport container into the center of the arena, with the delicate precision usually reserved for handling antimatter. All students, please ensure your personal safety fields are active. This is ridiculous, muttered Vrex, though Tom noticed the crystalline cadet activated his force field with suspicious haste. We're the Galactic Elite. We shouldn't need protection from some primitive animal. Phase 3, Specimen Release in 3, 2, 1. The containment unit's doors slid open with a hiss of equalizing pressure. And for exactly 2.7 seconds, nothing happened. The arena remained peacefully quiet, filled only with the gentle hum of environmental systems and the smug confidence of 66 alien cadets who had never met a real predator. Then Brutus emerged. 800 pounds of fur, muscle, and concentrated irritation flowed out of the container like a furry avalanche with personal grievances. Brutus had spent the last 18 hours in cramped quarters, eating processed food, and listening to the mechanical vibrations of starship engines. His mood had not improved. He rose onto his hind legs, all 9 feet of him, and released a roar that shook the transparent aluminum walls like a seismic event. The sound was primal. It spoke of ancient forests, where creatures like Brutus were the undisputed kings of their domain. It carried the promise of violence, the threat of claws and teeth, and the unmistakable message that this particular bear had exactly zero tolerance for nonsense. The reaction was immediate and spectacular. Vrex's crystalline carapace shifted through 17 different colors in as many seconds, finally settling on what could only be described as panic purple. His mandibles clicked frantically as he tried to activate emergency protocols he'd never bothered to learn. The Theridian Collective's perfect unity shattered instantly. Their synchronized movements became a frantic scramble as all three representatives tried to climb over each other to reach higher seats. Their pheromone releases shifted from superiority to pure terror, filling their section with the unmistakable scent of alien fear. Nastica and Garith activated their emergency breathing apparatus so rapidly that their water reservoirs overflowed, soaking the students in the rows below. Garith actually tried to hide behind his sister, which would have been more effective if Zolonians weren't completely transparent when frightened. Kylie, Admiral Drahern's perfectly trained daughter, maintained her military bearing for approximately 4 seconds before her species' natural flight response kicked in. She activated her seat's emergency ejection system, launching herself toward the exit with undignified haste. But it was Zephyr's reaction that provided the evening's true entertainment. The general's son, who had been so confident about taming the pathetic earth beast, managed to fall backwards off his chair while simultaneously activating his personal force field, emergency beacon, and what appeared to be a distress call to his father. His scaled hide shifted from confident gold to terrified brown faster than a chameleon with commitment issues. "Get it away," he shrieked, his voice cracking like an adolescent entering puberty. "Someone tranquilize it. Call security. Call my father." Corvin, despite his species' reputation for tactical intelligence, chose this moment to demonstrate that panic makes even the smartest aliens do incredibly stupid things. He activated his hover seat's maximum ascent, shooting toward the ceiling like a terrified balloon. Unfortunately, he forgot about the chamber's upper safety barriers and bounced off them with a sound like a wet fish slapping concrete. The chaos was magnificent. 66 of the galaxy's supposedly finest military cadets reduced to panicking children by one moderately annoyed bear. Tom would have found it hilarious if he weren't busy trying to maintain professional composure while his career imploded in real time. Through all this magnificent pandemonium, one figure remained perfectly still. Amy Kowalski sat in her back row seat, datapad balanced on her knee, taking notes with the casual attention of someone observing a mildly interesting science experiment. She hadn't activated her force field. She hadn't reached for any emergency controls. She hadn't even looked up from her notes when Brutus had roared loud enough to rattle the walls. She just sat there, occasionally glancing at the bear with the kind of expression most people reserved for checking the weather. "Fascinating," she murmured to herself, though her voice was too quiet for anyone to hear over the continued alien hysteria. Standard territorial display behavior, probably stressed from confinement and unfamiliar surroundings. Nothing a little space and some proper food wouldn't fix. Meanwhile, Brutus had finished his initial dominance display, and was now investigating his new environment with the methodical curiosity of a creature determining whether this was his territory now or just a temporary inconvenience. Brutus paused in his territorial survey, massive head tilting to one side with the kind of focused attention that had made his species apex predators for millions of years. Something had caught his interest, and it wasn't the continued hysteria of the alien students, most of whom were still trying to activate emergency protocols they'd never bothered to learn. His black nose twitched, sampling the air with the sophisticated olfactory system that could detect a salmon upstream from 3 miles away. Through the chaos of alien pheromones, panic sweat and industrial cleaning solutions, he'd caught something else. Something familiar in this sterile, artificial environment. Something that smelled like home. Commander Tom Molly watched through his monitoring equipment as the bear's entire demeanor shifted. Where moments before Brutus had been all aggressive posturing and territorial threats, now he moved with the careful precision of a predator who'd found something genuinely interesting. "What's it doing?" Zephyr whispered from behind his force field, which he'd cranked to maximum power, despite the fact that it was designed to stop energy weapons, not curious bears. Why did it stop roaring? Tom checked his instruments, but sensors couldn't explain the sudden change in the creature's behavior. Brutus was no longer displaying aggressive body language. Instead, he was searching. His massive head swept back and forth across the amphitheater, seating like a living radar dish. Then Brutus found what he was looking for. 800 pounds of apex predator focused entirely on the small human girl sitting quietly in the back row. For a moment that stretched like taffy, predator and human regarded each other across the demonstration chamber. Amy looked up from her datapad, meeting Brutus's gaze with the kind of calm directness that made Tom's blood pressure spike. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She didn't reach for her emergency controls. She smiled. "Hello there, big guy," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet as the other students finally realized something had changed. "You're having a rough day, aren't you?" What happened next would later be described by xenobiologists as unprecedented, by military analysts as impossible, and by Zephyr as a glitch in the simulation because reality doesn't work that way. Brutus sat down. All 800 pounds of fearsome predator settled onto his haunches like an enormous furry student waiting patiently for class to begin. His ears, which had been flattened in aggression moments before, pricked forward with interest. The low rumble that had been building in his chest shifted from threat to what could only be described as a questioning whine. "That's not normal," Tom muttered, frantically checking his control systems for malfunctions. "That's not normal at all." The alien students had finally stopped their panicking, but only because they'd run out of ways to panic. Now they stared in growing confusion, as the terrifying earth beast that had sent them into hysterics began acting like a pet. "Is it broken?" Vrex asked, his crystalline carapace cycling through confused blue-green patterns. "Did someone tranquilize it?" "No tranquilizers have been administered," Tom replied, though his voice carried the uncertainty of someone watching their understanding of the universe crumble in real time. "All systems show normal readings." Amy shifted slightly in her seat, and Brutus's massive head followed the movement like a sunflower tracking the sun. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, and studied the bear with the kind of thoughtful attention she might give a puzzle. "You're not really angry, are you?" she said, her voice carrying the gentle cadence people used with nervous animals. "You're just scared and confused. New place, strange smells, loud noises. I'd be grumpy too." Brutus made a sound that no bear in the history of Earth had ever made in front of alien witnesses. It was soft, almost questioning, like a giant furry question mark with claws. Tom's voice crackled over the intercom, barely controlled panic bleeding through his professional tone. "Please don't, whatever you're thinking of doing, don't do it." "I'm not doing anything," Amy replied, never taking her eyes off Brutus. "He's just homesick." Homesick. Tom's 3 eyes blinked in sequence, as he processed that word. The most dangerous predator from a Class 7 death world was homesick. Homesick. Zephyr's voice cracked again. "It's a mindless beast. Beasts don't get homesick." Amy finally looked away from Brutus, turning to face her classmates with an expression of mild surprise. "Mindless? Brutus isn't mindless. Grizzly bears are incredibly intelligent. They have excellent memories, complex social structures, and emotional ranges that would surprise you." "You know about these creatures?" Kylie asked, having returned from her undignified evacuation to witness this impossible scene. "Of course I do," Amy said matter-of-factly. "I'm from Earth. We share the planet with them." The silence that followed this statement was so complete that Tom could hear the environmental systems cycling through their standard operations. 66 alien minds tried to process the concept that humans and creatures like Brutus coexisted on the same world. "Share? The planet?" Corvin whispered from his position near the ceiling, where he remained after his unfortunate encounter with the upper barriers. "You mean, there are more of them?" "Oh, thousands," Amy replied cheerfully, as if discussing the weather. "Black bears, polar bears, sun bears, sloth bears. Brutus here is actually pretty average-sized for a grizzly. I've seen bigger." Bigger. The word hung in the air like a particularly ominous prophecy. Meanwhile, Brutus had been following this conversation with the patient attention of someone waiting for adults to finish talking so the interesting person would focus on him again. When Amy turned back to him, his ears perked up hopefully. "You miss the mountains, don't you?" Amy said softly. "And the rivers, and trees that don't smell like metal, and recycled air." Brutus huffed, a sound that somehow conveyed entire volumes about the inadequacy of processed nutrition cubes compared to fresh salmon. "I know, buddy," Amy continued, her voice carrying the kind of unconscious sympathy that came from understanding. "Space food is terrible. I've been here 3 months and I still dream about my mom's cooking." She paused, considering something, then made a decision that would later require approximately 17 different incident reports. Amy stood up. Every alien in the amphitheater either gasped, squeaked, or made whatever sound their species produced when witnessing imminent disaster. Emergency alarms should have been blaring. Security should have been rushing in. Tom should have been implementing emergency protocols. Instead, everyone simply watched as the small human girl walked calmly down the amphitheater steps toward 800 pounds of apex predator. "Amy, no," Tom whispered, but his voice carried no real authority. He was watching something that shouldn't be possible, and all his training had prepared him for many things, but not for this. Brutus watched her approach with the focused attention of a creature seeing something wonderful and unexpected. As Amy drew closer, his massive bulk shifted, not in aggression or preparation to flee, but in what could only be described as anticipation. When she reached the barrier, separating the seating area from the demonstration chamber, Amy paused and looked directly at the bear. "Would you like some company?" she asked, as if she were talking to a lonely neighbor rather than a creature that could rearrange her anatomy with casual ease. Brutus answered by lying down completely, resting his enormous head on his paws in the universal gesture of non-threatening animals everywhere. "I think," Amy said to the stunned amphitheater, "he just wants a friend." What followed was the kind of casual conversation that would later be studied by xenobiologists, military strategists, and several teams of psychologists, trying to understand how one human girl had managed to completely rewrite everything the galaxy thought it knew about apex predators. "So," Mystica ventured, her voice barely above a whisper, "you're saying these creatures just live on your planet, like freely?" Amy had somehow convinced Tom to lower the barrier, though he couldn't quite remember agreeing to it. Now she sat cross-legged on the demonstration chamber floor, while Brutus sprawled beside her like the world's largest, most dangerous therapy dog. Occasionally, he would huff contentedly when Amy scratched behind his ears. "Well, not in the cities," Amy replied, matter-of-factly, as if this were the most reasonable question in the universe. "That would be impractical. But yes, they live wild in the forests, mountains, and national parks. Yellowstone alone has around 150 grizzlies." 150, Zephyr repeated faintly. "In one location. Oh, that's nothing," Amy continued cheerfully, apparently unaware that she was systematically destroying the sanity of everyone present. "Alaska has about 30,000 brown bears. Then there are the polar bears in the Arctic, black bears throughout North America. Really, Brutus here is pretty average. I've seen grizzlies that were nearly twice his size." Commander Tom Molly felt something inside his thorax that might have been his heart attempting to relocate to his throat. Twice Brutus's size meant creatures approaching half a ton of mobile destruction, and this human child was discussing them like they were neighborhood pets. "But surely," Vrex interjected, his crystalline structure still flickering nervous purples, "surely your species has weapons to control them. Advanced technology. Orbital defense platforms." Amy looked puzzled. "Why would we need orbital platforms for bears? If you don't bother them, they usually don't bother you. Most attacks happen when people do something stupid like get between a mother and her cubs, or leave food around campsites." "Campsites?" Corvin squeaked from his elevated position. "You mean humans voluntarily go into areas where these things live, for recreation?" "Camping is fun," Amy said defensively. "Fresh air, hiking, fishing. Though you do have to hang your food properly so bears don't get into it. Learned that lesson the hard way when I was 12. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. 66 alien minds attempted to process the concept that humans not only shared their planet with creatures like Brutus, but actively sought them out for entertainment purposes. "Hang on," Kylie said slowly. Military training finally overriding panic. "If these creatures are so dangerous, how did your species achieve dominance?" "Superior technology. Evolutionary advantages." Amy shrugged, the gesture causing Brutus to shift his massive head to get a better view of her face. "We're persistence hunters, good at planning, problem solving, using tools. Plus we're really good at killing things when we need to." That last sentence dropped into the amphitheater like a tactical nuke in a children's playground. "Killing things," Tom repeated slowly, his voice carrying the tone of someone watching their worldview collapse in real time. "Well, yeah," Amy said, as if this were obvious. "How do you think we got to the top of the food chain? We're not the biggest or the strongest, but we're absolutely the most dangerous when we put our minds to it. Bears are powerful, but they're not vindictive. Humans can hold grudges for generations." Brutus chose that moment to roll onto his back, presenting his belly to Amy like a dog seeking attention. 800 pounds of apex predator behaving like an oversized puppy while casually discussing humanity's capacity for violence created a cognitive dissonance that several students would need therapy to resolve. "The most dangerous," Zephyr whispered, finally understanding why his father's military briefings had classified Earth as approach with extreme caution. "Oh, absolutely," Amy confirmed cheerfully, rubbing Brutus's belly while he made contented rumbling sounds. "We've killed each other in incredibly creative ways for thousands of years. Wars, duels, elaborate revenge plots. We even have entire academic fields dedicated to studying the art of warfare. Brutus here just wants food and territory. Humans want revenge, justice, and sometimes we kill things just to prove a point." Tom watched this scene unfold with the growing realization that his carefully planned educational demonstration had become something closer to a revelation about interspecies relations. The most pampered, overconfident students in the galaxy were learning that the quiet human they'd ignored was possibly more dangerous than the creature they'd been terrified of, and said creature was currently making happy bear noises while getting belly rubs. "Commander Molly," came Admiral Vashi's voice over the private comm channel. "I'm receiving some rather concerning reports about today's demonstration." Tom's mandibles clicked in what his species called the rhythm of impending career termination. Through the observation window, he could see Amy standing up, brushing dust off her uniform, while Brutus followed her like an enormous furry shadow. "Everything is under control, Admiral," Tom replied, though his definition of control had expanded considerably in the last hour. "Under control." Vashi's voice carried the kind of skepticism usually reserved for junior officers, claiming they could explain the missing antimatter. "Because I'm looking at a live feed that shows our human exchange student apparently domesticating a Class 7 predator while simultaneously terrifying an entire classroom of military cadets." Tom watched Amy walk toward the chamber exit with Brutus padding along beside her, occasionally bumping his massive head against her shoulder in apparent affection. "That," Tom said slowly, "is a remarkably accurate summary of the situation, sir." The amphitheater had transformed into something resembling a xenobiological research station crossed with a therapy session for traumatized military cadets. Amy moved through the demonstration chamber, with Brutus following her like an enormous furry bodyguard, while 66 alien students watched in fascination, terror, and growing existential dread. "Brutus, sit," Amy said casually, not even looking back at the bear. 800 pounds of apex predator immediately planted his hindquarters on the floor with the obedience of a well-trained pet. Several alien students made small choking sounds. "Stay," Amy added, walking toward the environmental controls to examine the chamber's climate settings. Brutus remained perfectly still, though his eyes tracked her movement with the devotion usually reserved for religious figures or particularly excellent sources of food. "How?" Vrex whispered, his crystalline structure now a sickly yellow-green that indicated severe cognitive distress. "How is she doing that?" "Practice," Amy replied, without looking up from the control panel. "Though Brutus is being exceptionally good. Usually wild bears are much more stubborn about following commands from strangers. Usually," the word hung in the air like a particularly ominous storm cloud. "Usually?" Kylie asked, her military training warring with the growing suspicion that everything she'd been taught about threat assessment was fundamentally wrong. "Well, this isn't my first time working with large predators," Amy said matter-of-factly, adjusting the chamber's humidity levels. "My uncle runs a wildlife rehabilitation center in Montana. I've been helping there since I was 10. Bears, wolves, mountain lions. You learn to read their body language, understand what they need." She paused, considering something, then looked directly at the assembled students. "You know what the most dangerous part of working with wild animals is?" she asked. 66 alien throats made various sounds indicating they very much wanted to know, but were afraid to ask. "Getting overconfident," Amy continued. "The moment you start thinking you're in control, that's when they remind you who's really the apex predator." Respect goes both ways. Commander Tom Molly felt his career dissolving in real time as he listened to this casual lecture on predator management. His carefully planned demonstration had become an impromptu class on interspecies relations, taught by a human teenager to the supposed elite of galactic military academies. The worst part was that Amy was clearly the most qualified instructor in the room. "Commander," Admiral Vashi's voice crackled through the comm again, carrying the kind of patience that preceded very unpleasant conversations. "I need you to explain to me why our educational demonstration has become a diplomatic incident." Tom's three eyes focused on Amy, who was now showing Brutus how the chamber's feeding dispensers worked. The bear watched with intense concentration, as if memorizing the information for future reference. "Well, sir," Tom began, then stopped. How exactly did one explain that their human exchange student had accidentally revealed that Earth's inhabitants were potentially more dangerous than anything in the galactic bestiary? "Sir, it appears our threat assessment protocols may need revision," Tom said, finally. "Revision how?" Tom watched Amy give Brutus a final pat before walking toward the chamber exit. The bear followed her to the barrier, then sat down when she gestured for him to stay, his massive form radiating dejection. "Sir, I believe we may have been categorizing the wrong species as the primary threat." Meanwhile, the alien students were reaching their own conclusions about threat assessment, and those conclusions were causing what psychologists would later term adaptive worldview restructuring, though most participants described it as having their minds completely blown. If humans can control creatures like that, Zephyr said slowly, his scaled hide shifting through colors that indicated deep philosophical contemplation, what exactly does that make humans? The question rippled through the amphitheater like a particularly uncomfortable revelation. 66 young aliens, raised on stories of their species' superiority and galactic dominance, suddenly found themselves reconsidering everything they thought they knew about the universe. The apex predators, Nastica whispered, her aquatic breathing apparatus bubbling rapidly. Humans aren't the pets, they're the apex predators. But they're so small, Corvin protested weakly from his position near the ceiling, though his voice carried no real conviction. So are poison dart frogs, Amy pointed out cheerfully, gathering her datapad and preparing to leave. Size isn't everything. Sometimes the most dangerous things come in small packages. She paused at the amphitheater exit, looking back at the assembled students with an expression of mild concern. You know, she said thoughtfully, you might want to reconsider some of your assumptions about primitive planets. Just because a species doesn't have faster-than-light travel doesn't mean they're not dangerous. Some of the most effective weapons in the universe are remarkably simple. With that parting observation, Amy checked her schedule and headed for the door. I have advanced xenobiology next, she announced. Professor Morden is covering psychological warfare in pre-spaceflight civilizations. Always. Should be interesting. The door closed behind her with a soft hiss, leaving 66 alien students, one panicking instructor, and one very disappointed bear to contemplate the fundamental reorganization of their understanding of galactic power structures. Tom stared at his incident report forms, trying to figure out how to explain today's events without sounding like he'd suffered a complete psychological breakdown. How did one write? Human student accidentally revealed her species' true nature by befriending our demonstration predator in official military terminology. Attention students, he announced, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone whose worldview had been systematically demolished over the course of an hour. Today's lesson is concluded. Please proceed to your next classes in an orderly fashion, and perhaps spend some time reviewing the galactic diplomatic protocols regarding Earth. The exodus that followed was unlike anything in the Academy's history. Students who had entered the amphitheater with swaggering confidence slunk out like chastened children, casting nervous glances back at Brutus, who remained by the barrier looking forlornly at the door Amy had exited through. As the amphitheater emptied, Tom approached the chamber where Brutus sat in obvious depression, occasionally making soft whining sounds that somehow conveyed entire volumes about the unfairness of being abandoned by the first interesting person he'd met in weeks. I know, buddy, Tom said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the bear or himself. I know exactly how you feel. Through the observation windows, Tom could see Amy walking down the corridor toward her next class. Other students pressed themselves against the walls as she passed, though whether from newfound respect or primal terror, he couldn't tell. Probably both. In his pocket, Tom's communicator buzzed with an incoming message from Admiral Vashi. The preview text read, Mali's report to my office immediately. Bring coffee, and possibly a strong sedative. Tom looked at Brutus, who had now sprawled across the chamber floor in a pose that clearly indicated severe emotional distress. Well, Tom said to the depressed bear, at least you'll be going back to a nice quiet containment unit. I have to explain this mess to the Admiral. Brutus huffed in what might have been sympathy. Outside in the corridor, the whispered conversations had already begun. By dinner time, every student in the Academy would know that the quiet human girl from the Death World wasn't just another exchange student. She was something far more dangerous, a human who made apex predators look like house pets. And tomorrow, she had combat strategy with General Krafnog himself. Tom's mandibles clicked in what his species called the rhythm of impending galactic incident. This was going to require a lot more paperwork.